Welcome, dear friends, once again. I am here to present one new story, and today's story is going to cover about India's economic strategy to 2035 macro story. ये कई चरणों में इसको मैं इसका वीडियो बनाऊंगा. द रीजन इज दैट इट इज़ वेरी बिग आर्टिकल. तो सबसे पहले स्टार्ट करते हैं समरी से ही. लेट अस स्टार्ट दिस वीडियो. India's economy is of a global importance. It has a large and young population and an open and democratic political system. It is already the third largest economy and contributor to global economic growth. Yet, there is considerable untapped potential. With more than a sixth of the world's population, India produces only 7% of the world's output. यहाँ भारत पूरे विश्व का 7% केवल आउटपुट 7% आउटपुट वर्ल्ड का प्रोड्यूस करता है, which is very less, and it is cause of concern also for macro policy makers. India has enjoyed a steep up in growth rates over the past few decades, supported by reform efforts and the expansion of its aspirational consumer class. This report assumes a growth rate of 6 to 8% annually over the next two decades, underpinned by productivity improvements. Given the challenges of policy making in such a large, diverse country with a federal structure of government, reforms will likely proceed incrementally and be politically opportunistic. Both the central and state governments have important roles to play. Make the most of India's demographic advantages will require labor market reforms, measures to improve education and skills, and significantly improving women's participation in the economy. Constraints on investments and infrastructure pose a challenge, while India's service oriented growth path will take it into uncharted territory. India's economic progress will not be linear. It will be subject to structural shifts and will be shaped by technological and environmental disruptions. Outlook for the Indian economy to 2035. India's economic potential and importance. India's growth path will be driven by how effectively it harnesses and rewards the efforts of its greatest natural assets, its people. India has the second largest population in the world with more than 1.3 billion people. Of India's 29 states and 7 union territories, 18 are home to more people than Australia. India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, is bigger than Brazil, the world's fifth most populous country. Within the next decades, India's population will overtake China's to become the world's largest. By 2035, the United Nations projects that India's population will have reached almost 1.6 billion people on its way to peak of almost 1.7 billion by the early 2060s. India is the world's third largest economy measured in purchasing power parity PPP terms, and on some measures will be the fastest growing large economy in the world in the coming years. अब ये फिगर देख सकते हैं. टेबल है हमारे सामने. शेयर्स ऑफ टेबल नहीं है ये, ग्राफ है. शेयर्स ऑफ वर्ल्ड जीडीपी एंड पॉपुलेशन G20 कंट्रीज का दिया हुआ है यहाँ पर. आप इसमें देख सकते हैं चाइना इज ऑन टॉप. और यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स की पोजीशन देख लीजिए क्या है. तो इसमें सोर्स ये किस सोर्स लिया गया है? इंटरनेशनल मॉनेटरी फंड, वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक आउटलुक, अप्रैल 2018. इंटरनेशनल मॉनेटरी फंड 2018. जीडीपी इज इन परचेजिंग पावर पैरिटी टर्म्स, डेटा 2017 का है. तो इंडियाज पॉपुलेशन हैज़ बेनिफिटेड from this strong economic performance. India's step towards liberalization and openness in the 1980s which accelerated in the 1990s, saw India's GDP growth rise from an average annual rate of less than 3% in 1970s, the so-called Hindu rate of growth, to over 7% in recent years. India GDP growth. GDP growth को यहाँ दिखाया गया है. Let us see this one and explore annual GDP growth 1956-57 और उसके बाद बीच में जंप लेता है और कम निगेटिव भी आता है 66-67. ये चाइना वॉर का इम्पैक्ट यहाँ दिखाया जा सकता है. अगेन 76-77 और 70 जो इमरजेंसी लागू की गई थी इसके बाद स्थिति बहुत खराब हो डाउनफॉल दिखाया गया है. अगेन 86-87 अच्छा रहा, बढ़ता जा रहा है. 96-97 में भी ठीक रहा. 2006-2007 में बढ़िया रहा और 2016-17 में थोड़ा डाउनफॉल जरूर हुआ. हालांकि ये 96-97 में भी डाउनफॉल था. तो ये सोर्स लिया गया द वर्ल्ड बैंक जीडीपी ग्रोथ एनुअल, वर्ल्ड बैंक नेशनल अकाउंट्स डेटा एंड OECD National Accounts, the World Bank 2018, International Monetary Fund IMF, World Economic Outlook 2018, International Monetary Fund, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Summary of Macroeconomic Aggregates at Constant Price, New Delhi. Since 1970, India's real GDP per capita has increased fivefold. As a result, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. Key development indicators such as infant mortality and life expectancy have steadily improved. These trends have contributed to the creation of a substantial and aspirational consumer class that, since household consumption accounts for 60% of India's GDP, is an important source of optimism for growth in the Indian economy. Baseline scenario: under even moderate policy progress, the Australian Treasury law, Treasury's long-term projections framework projects that over the next uh, 2 decades and beyond, India can maintain the relatively high economic growth required to lift its share of a global output. Under Treasury's projection, India will enjoy an average of around 6% annual growth over the next 2 decades. As population growth continues to slow, improved productivity will remain the critical driver of GDP growth. Based on the incremental reforms outlined in the next section, this strategy judges India is likely to grow 6 to 8% annually in 2035. India's success will have significant implications for its international economic and strategic weight. In 2035, the global economy is likely to be increasing weighted towards Asia as India, China, and the Asian economies catch up to slower growing advanced economies. Even with an average annual growth rate of only 6%, India's economy would be more than 2 times larger than it was in 2017. In PPP terms, India's share of the global economy will likely increase from 7% in 2016 to around 13%, making it one of the major poles of global economic power and on par with the United States. Drivers of India's long-term growth. 1985, working age population. Okay, and slowly working age population has decreased and productivity is also shown, and you can say the productivity was higher in terms of 2025 to 20, 2010, 2005 and to 1990. In between it was ups and downs. Shares of world GDP projections. Yeah, China is ahead. And Indonesia, Japan, United States. United States is going down. Japan is also going down, leading economy. Indonesia is increasing order, but it is also much below. China is increasing. Okay, continuously China is increasing, and India is also increasing, but it is far below China. Incremental reforms are likely, which will boost growth. In recent years, a greater recognition in India of the urgency for reforms to lift productivity has led to important policy achievements, including implementation of a national GST in 2017, as well as simplify the tax system. The GST sets new procedures for cooperation among the states. Future reforms will likely likely proceed incrementally. Both the central and state governments have the political appetite to do more. Both levels of government have important roles to play. The central government has direct control over several important areas, including the financial sector, financial service sector, international trade policies, settings, and investment policy. The investment story. India's state governments control crucial elements of the business environment. The central government has fostered a political dynamic in favor of reform, which will see uneven progress between state organizations such as Niti Aayog have used initiatives like comparative federalism to help states recognize the need for and speed up the pace of reform. Weak capacity at both the central and the state level to implement challenging policy changes is a key constraint. Attempts to circumvent the license Raj by moving regulatory approval system online will improve the business environment in some areas. Recently, enacted fiscal targets and formal guidance for monetary policy will also continue to support a favorable environment for growth. Macro stability through improvements in external indicators such as current account, foreign exchange reserves, and inflation have also helped. However, fiscal measures continues to pose a risk for many state governments where borrowing has increased rapidly in recent years and the scope to increase debt and expenditure appears limited. However, fiscal measures continues to pose a risk for many state governments where borrowing has increased rapidly in recent years and the scope to increase debt and expenditure appears limited. India's economic reform agenda must address three themes. It's a growth model and international openness, it's a workforce and building the infrastructure to improve productivity. India's growth model. Like other emerging economies, India's growth has been marked by major shifts in the structure of its economy, most notably away from low productivity agriculture. Sectoral shares of the Indian economy. The shift away from agriculture and a strong growth in service is not unusual for a developing economy like India. What is less common in the limited role that manufacturing has played in India's development. For a typical developing economy, manufacturing drives growth and employment in the early development phase before giving way to service. For many East Asian economies, this last stage typically has occurred at much higher levels of development than in India. However, in many parts of the South Asia, the service sector has grown ahead of manufacturing. In the traditional growth model, the service the services sector in developing economies is considered to be of lower productivity than manufacturing. In South Asia and particularly in India, the reverse has been true. The level of India's service productivity is comparable with China and Thailand, countries with substantially higher GDP per capita. As a result, India's early shift to service has supported rather than hindered rapid growth. Policy settings have supported the dominance of services. The strong expansion of India's service sector has been enhanced by a series of reforms introduced by the Indian government through the 1990s and early 2000s. Notably, reforms included financial market deregulations, a relaxation of foreign ownership regulations, and moves to increase competitions in a wide range of service industries, along with the relatively higher cost of capital policy, uh, higher higher along with the relatively high cost of capital policy choice also appeared to explain India's relative underperformance in manufacturing. Burdensome regulations, including outdated labor laws and complex land acquisitions regulations, have been particularly onerous for manufacturing. India's service success extends to exports, where a range of Indian services are globally competitive, particularly in information and communications technology and in back office processing tasks. This reflects India's comparative advantage, a relatively low cost workforce with a small, high skilled component, many of whom are English speaking. While India's service sector output has grown substantially, service sector employment has been far more modest. This has meant that a relatively small proportion of India's population has seen direct benefits. The more large scale employment the services sector can provide India, the greater the benefits for India's development. While India's services sector output has grown substantially, services sector employment has been far more modest. This has meant that a relatively small proportion of India's population has seen direct benefits. The more large scale employment the service sector can provide India, the greater the benefit for India's development. Over coming decades, the service shares of the economy is likely to gradually continue rising and the share of manufacturing stabilizes. As income rises, the demand for consumer goods and services is expected to grow strongly, creating opportunities for domestic manufacturing. Global manufacturing firms are also likely to be attracted by India's large and growing consumer class and is relatively low operating cost. तो ये हमारा था मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक व्यू का पहला वीडियो और इसमें मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक व्यू के बारे में बहुत सारी जानकारियाँ दी गई हैं पॉलिसी मैटर्स के बारे में चर्चा की गई और वर्ल्ड ट्रेड में भारत की जो स्थिति है और उसमें क्या किया जाना चाहिए उसके बदलावों को यहाँ दिखाने का प्रयास किया गया है और ये भी साथ साथ बताया गया है कि इंडिया का जो ग्रोथ है आगे आने वाले समय में वो काफ़ी उसमें स्टेबिलिटी रहेगी और स्पेशली आफ्टर कोविड जिस तरह के सिनेरियो बदल रहे हैं और फिजिकल जो भारत की स्थिति जो फिजिकल डेफिसिट है लगातार भारत को कम करने का प्रयास करना चाहिए और लेकिन फिजिकल डेफिसिट्स में जो कंट्रीब्यूशन है उसमें टोटल जो एक्सपेंडिचर है टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर माइनस टोटल रिसिप्ट एक्सक्लूडिंग बोरिंग ये होता है फिजिकल डेफिसिट। तो अगर हमारा कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर है हो रहा है तो दैट इज़ गुड क्योंकि कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर से हमारा फ्यूचर बेस तैयार होता है और इस फ्यूचर बेस पर देश का बहुत कुछ निर्भर करता है। लेकिन एक संस्कृत में एक लाइन कही गई है यावत जीवेत सुखं जीवेत ऋणं कृत्वा घृतं पिबेत। जब तक जियो सुख से जियो और ऋण लेकर अगर घी पीना पड़े तो पी लेना चाहिए। तो ये कर्ज लेने वाले लोग ऐसे ही बोलते हैं बट वी शुड नॉट borrow much because it is a future burden. If you are borrowing today, we have to pay the interest and it is a burden for the future generations welfare because the revenue expenditure हमारा कम हो जाएगा। अगर हम ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा बोरोइंग करते हैं तो उसका जो इंटरेस्ट होता है वो हमारा रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर का पार्ट होता है और उसको हमको पे करना पड़ता है। इसलिए कुल मिला के ये कहा सकता है कि इंडिया का फ्यूचर अभी बहुत ब्राइट है। स्पेशली जो वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमी को देखा जाए तो बहुत सारी इकोनॉमीज़ जब भी काफ़ी लो है या डिसमल उनका परफॉर्मेंस चल रहा है, वैसे में भारत की तरफ दुनिया होप से देख रही है। और यहाँ साथ भी ये भी कहा है कि भी सर्विस सेक्टर का जो ग्रोथ है वो और मॉडेस्ट रूप में होना चाहिए और अच्छे तरीके से होना चाहिए इसमें। और जो ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा लोगों को इसमें एकोमोडेट करने की बात यहाँ चर्चा की गई है, और जिससे कि और ग्रोथ हो, और इसमें छोटे छोटे उद्योगों पर भी इस पर फोकस किया जाएगा। इसमें अगले एपिसोड में इन सब बातों पर हम चर्चा करेंगे, जिसमें हमारा अगला एपिसोड होगा इंडियाज़ वर्कफोर्स इज एन अपॉर्चुनिटी एंड अ चैलेंज। ये हमारा अगला वीडियो होगा, इंडियाज़ वर्कफोर्स इज एन अपॉर्चुनिटी एंड अ चैलेंज। थैंक यू।